Hello, and welcome. Today, we are examining one of the most unexpected names in the Epstein files. A name that stops people when they first encounter it, because it belongs to someone the world has placed in a category almost entirely separate from the world of Jeffrey Epstein. Stephen Hawking, the physicist who explained the origins of the universe from a wheelchair. The man who survived 55 years with a disease that kills most people within 2 to 5 years of diagnosis. The public intellectual who brought the most complex ideas in modern science to millions of ordinary readers. A symbol in the popular imagination of pure human reason at its highest. And yet, his name is in the files. Not in the way the most sensational social media posts suggest, not in the way the most extreme online claims allege, but it is there in a specific and documented context, and that context deserves honest examination. Before we go any further, let us establish what this video is and what it is not. This is not a hit piece on Stephen Hawking. He died in March of 2018. He cannot speak to the questions we're about to raise. He cannot provide context, correct misunderstandings, or offer testimony. That fact alone imposes a specific ethical obligation on any analysis of his name in these files. We will not fabricate connections the evidence does not support. We will not imply guilt where no accusation exists, and we will not sensationalize a story that is already complex enough on its own terms. What we will do is examine the documented facts with the same rigor we apply to every subject in this channel's analysis. We will look at exactly how and where Hawking's name appears in materials related to Epstein. We will analyze Epstein's documented pattern of cultivating famous scientists and intellectuals to build social legitimacy. We will address the viral misinformation that is circulated about this story, and we will ask the questions the public record raises while being completely transparent about the limits of what we can know. This analysis is grounded in publicly available court documents, credible investigative journalism, verified reporting, and the methodology of evidence-based reasoning. We distinguish throughout between confirmed fact, reasonable inference based on patterns, and speculation. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the foundation of honest analysis. Let us begin with the facts.
Stephen Hawking's name appears in the Epstein-related public record in a specific and bounded context. According to materials that entered the public domain through court proceedings, congressional document releases, and investigative reporting, Hawking was a participant in a scientific conference held on Epstein's private island, Little St. James, in the United States Virgin Islands. The year was 2006. This is the foundation of the entire story. It is a documented fact. Hawking attended an event organized by Epstein on his property. Everything else, every claim, every inference, every question, must be understood in relation to this single verifiable point. He was at a conference on an island owned by Jeffrey Epstein in 2006. What the files do not contain is equally important to establish clearly. Hawking's name does not appear in any victim testimony accusing him of participating in or witnessing sexual abuse. His name does not appear in documents describing him as receiving sexual services or as directing others to engage in criminal behavior. He is not listed in flight logs associated with the kind of travel that has been connected to trafficking in other cases. The conference itself is the documented connection, that and nothing more, based on the materials currently available to the public. There is also a photograph that became widely circulated after the Epstein files began generating sustained public attention. The photograph, reportedly taken at one of Epstein's properties, shows Hawking in the company of individuals connected to Epstein's world. This photograph became viral in a way that implied a deeper or more sinister connection than the evidence supports. A photograph of two people in the same location is evidence that they were in the same location. It is not evidence of complicity, shared knowledge, or criminal behavior. That distinction matters, and we will maintain it throughout this analysis. There have also been specific false claims circulating online claiming that the Epstein files contain explicit criminal allegations against Hawking. Those claims are false. They can be checked against the actual released documents. No such allegations exist in the publicly available materials. We state this directly because part of responsible analysis is correcting misinformation, not just presenting nuanced readings of genuine evidence. So the starting point is this: Hawking attended a conference on Epstein's island in 2006. That is what the files show about him. Now we need to understand what that actually means.
The 2006 conference on Little St. James deserves its own careful examination because understanding what it was, who organized it, and who attended it is essential to evaluating what Hawking's presence there actually signifies. Epstein had, by 2006, cultivated a substantial reputation in certain circles as a patron of science. He had donated money to research programs, hosted dinners with leading intellectuals, and positioned himself publicly as someone genuinely interested in cutting-edge physics, mathematics, and evolutionary biology. The Island Conference fit this persona. It was presented as a gathering of serious scientists for serious discussion. The invitation would have come through channels that looked legitimate to anyone receiving it, organized under the banner of intellectual inquiry by a man who had, at least on the surface, established credentials as a scientific philanthropist. Who else attended? The full guest list for the 2006 conference has not been entirely confirmed in the public record. What we know is that Hawking was among the attendees. Other prominent scientists and academics were also reportedly present, though the specifics varied depending on the source. This matters because the conference was not an isolated one-on-one encounter between Hawking and Epstein. It was a group event, a scientific gathering of the kind that takes place in academia with some regularity, unusual only in its venue. The venue itself is where questions properly begin. Little St. James is a private island in the Caribbean. It is property that Epstein owned. It is also, as we now know, a location that was central to Epstein's criminal operations. The same island where scientists gathered for intellectual discussion was the same island where, at other times, Epstein was committing serious crimes. These facts coexist, and they need to be held simultaneously rather than resolved artificially in one direction or the other. Did the scientists attending the conference in 2006 know what else happened on that island? The evidence strongly suggests they did not know the full picture. What they knew, or had reason to know, depended entirely on what information was available to them at that specific moment. And that question brings us directly to the next critical point in this analysis. This is perhaps the most important and most consistently overlooked dimension of the Hawking story in the Epstein files. To evaluate what any person did or did not know when they attended an Epstein event, we need to establish precisely what was publicly known about Epstein at that time. The Palm Beach Police Department opened an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein in 2005. By 2006, that investigation was ongoing. Epstein was first arrested in July of 2006, charged with solicitation of prostitution involving a minor. This means that at the time the Island Conference took place, there was an active criminal investigation of Epstein. His conduct was known to local law enforcement in Florida. However, here is the critical question. What was known publicly, and specifically, what was known to someone in Hawking's position? The 2005 and early 2006 investigation was not a major national news story. Coverage was largely local, centered in Palm Beach and Florida media. The national press had not yet made Epstein a household name. The full extent of his crimes, the trafficking network, the involvement of powerful figures from around the world, the island as a crime scene, none of this was public knowledge in 2006.
For Stephen Hawking, a British scientist based primarily at the University of Cambridge, the probability that he had access to or awareness of a local Florida criminal investigation involving a man he knew as a scientific patron is genuinely low. His social world, his information environment, and his professional context were all substantially removed from the Palm Beach social circuit, where Epstein's conduct was becoming an open secret among a certain set of people. This is not an excuse or an exoneration. It is a factual assessment of information availability. Context matters when we evaluate human decisions. A person who accepts an invitation to a scientific conference without knowing that the host is under criminal investigation is in a fundamentally different moral and factual position than a person who accepts an invitation while knowing about ongoing criminal charges. We have no evidence that Hawking had the latter knowledge. We have considerable structural reason to think he did not. What we can say is that the 2006 conference took place in a window when Epstein's criminality was becoming visible to law enforcement, but had not yet become visible to the broader public. That window matters enormously for understanding how intelligent and careful people ended up in Epstein's orbit during that period. To understand why Stephen Hawking attended an Epstein conference, we need to understand a dimension of the Epstein case that has received serious attention from investigative journalists, but rarely gets the analytical treatment it deserves. Epstein's relationship with the scientific and academic world was not casual or incidental. It was strategic, sustained, and deeply revealing about how he operated. Epstein spent years and substantial money cultivating relationships with some of the most respected scientists and intellectuals alive. He donated to Harvard University, where he funded a program in evolutionary dynamics and was closely associated with the late evolutionary biologist Martin Nowak. He donated to MIT, where his financial relationships with the Media Lab became the subject of a major internal investigation after his 2019 arrest, revealing that staff had been deliberately instructed to obscure his donations in official records. He funded fellowships, visiting scholar programs, private seminars, and exactly the kind of island conferences that brought Hawking to Little St. James. What did Epstein want from these relationships? Several things, operating simultaneously. First, and most visibly, he wanted intellectual legitimacy. He wanted to be seen as a serious thinker, a patron of science rather than merely a wealthy financier. When you can say that you have had dinner with Nobel laureates and hosted Stephen Hawking at your island retreat, you occupy a different social category than someone whose wealth comes without intellectual credibility. In the circles Epstein wanted to inhabit, scientific prestige was a form of social currency, and he collected it deliberately. Second, these connections provided what we can accurately describe as social armor. When law enforcement or journalists began looking more carefully at Epstein, the fact that his name was associated with major universities, with respected scientists, with programs at Harvard and MIT, made it harder to categorize him simply as a criminal. Institutions that had accepted his money had institutional incentives to protect their relationship with him. Colleagues who had dined with him or attended his events had social incentives not to believe the worst. The veneer of intellectual respectability was, structurally speaking, a shield. Third, the academic network gave Epstein access to new circles of powerful people. Scientists know politicians, business leaders, and government officials. They move in overlapping worlds. Epstein's connection to science was also a connection to the broader elite networks that intersected with it. For a figure like Stephen Hawking, the dynamics had a particular character. Hawking did not need Epstein's money or his social connections. Hawking was already one of the most famous human beings alive.
His attendance at an Epstein conference would have conferred legitimacy on the event rather than benefiting Hawking professionally. He was, from Epstein's perspective, a trophy, a symbol of the kind of intellectual seriousness that Epstein wanted to project. Whether Hawking was aware of this role or not, he played it by attending. This is not a judgment, it is a description of how the system worked. Epstein was extraordinarily skilled at identifying people who could serve specific functions in his social architecture and creating contexts in which they would naturally and willingly participate. The 2006 conference was one such context. The scientists who attended it were, for the most part, not knowing participants in a deception. They were targets of a strategy that was designed precisely to look like something legitimate and intellectually serious.
One specific factual question that arises in any analysis of Hawking's connection to Epstein is whether there were direct or indirect financial relationships between Epstein and research programs associated with Hawking. This question matters because financial ties represent a qualitatively different kind of connection than social attendance at a conference. What the public record shows is the following. Epstein made substantial, documented donations to MIT and Harvard, where connections to specific named researchers have been thoroughly investigated and reported. The MIT Media Lab situation, where internal emails showed deliberate concealment of Epstein's identity as a donor, is the most detailed, publicly documented case of institutional financial entanglement with Epstein in the academic world. Regarding Cambridge University and its connection to Hawking's work specifically, the picture is less clearly defined in the public record. There are no confirmed, publicly documented direct financial relationships between Epstein and Hawking's personal research programs equivalent to the MIT or Harvard situations. This does not mean such relationships did not exist. The full scope of Epstein's financial support for academic institutions has not been completely mapped, and some of his donations were deliberately obscured. But we cannot assert a financial connection where the evidence does not currently confirm one. What we can say is that Epstein's pattern of using financial support to create relationships with prestigious institutions was systematic. Whether or not Hawking personally benefited financially from Epstein connections, the broader network of Epstein's academic philanthropy created the ecosystem in which the 2006 conference could be organized and attended by people of Hawking's caliber. The money and the social relationships were intertwined, even where specific individual financial ties cannot be confirmed.
There is an aspect of Stephen Hawking's situation that is almost never addressed directly in coverage of his connection to the Epstein files, but which is fundamental to any intellectually honest assessment. Stephen Hawking was severely physically disabled. He had been living with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis since he was first diagnosed in 1963. By 2006, when the Island Conference took place, he was essentially completely paralyzed. He communicated through a single cheek muscle connected to a voice synthesizer. He required around-the-clock medical care from a team of nurses and assistants. He traveled in a specially configured wheelchair with medical equipment. The practical implication of this reality is significant. Decisions about where Hawking traveled, what invitations he accepted, and what events he attended were not made in isolation by Hawking alone. They were made through a process involving his personal assistant, his medical care team, his academic colleagues, and in many cases, his family. The logistics of taking Stephen Hawking to a private island in the Caribbean in 2006 required the involvement and agreement of multiple people. Someone arranged travel. Someone evaluated the invitation. Someone confirmed that the conference was legitimate and worth the significant logistical effort of bringing Hawking there. This matters for the question of what Hawking knew. But it also raises a separate and equally important question. What did the people around him know?
Who in Hawking's immediate team received the invitation from Epstein or his representatives? What due diligence, if any, was done on the host in the event? These people had access to information that Hawking himself may have been less directly exposed to. Their role in the decision-making process is a significant gap in the public record. We should also consider what Hawking's physical situation meant in terms of his experience at the conference itself. A man who travels with a full medical team, who communicates with considerable effort, who is physically dependent on others for every basic function, exists in a fundamentally different relationship to his social environment than a fully mobile person attending the same event. His exposure to and awareness of what was happening elsewhere on the island or in Epstein's broader social world would have been filtered through the people around him and constrained by the physical realities of his situation. We raise these points not to diminish Hawking's agency or intelligence, which were formidable regardless of his physical condition. We raise them because intellectual honesty requires accounting for all relevant factors. Hawking's physical situation is one of the most relevant factors in this entire story, and it has been almost entirely absent from public discussion.
Hawking was not the only distinguished scientist or intellectual to have attended events organized by Epstein. The broader pattern of Epstein's relationships with the academic world included figures from physics, mathematics, biology, and philosophy. Some of these individuals responded to Epstein's 2019 arrest with public statements acknowledging their past associations and expressing regret. Others have remained silent. The range of responses itself tells us something about the range of these relationships. Some of the scientists who had connections to Epstein clearly had a deeper level of ongoing engagement with him, receiving funding, attending multiple events over multiple years, or maintaining contact even after warning signs became available. Others had what appeared to have been more limited and isolated interactions, attending a conference or a dinner without developing an ongoing relationship. Understanding where Hawking falls on this spectrum requires information we do not fully have. But the single documented connection to the 2006 conference suggests a more bounded interaction than was the case for some others in Epstein's academic network. The comparison also illuminates the institutional failure dimension of this story. When individuals like Martin Nowak at Harvard or the researchers at MIT's Media Lab received Epstein's support, they did so within institutional frameworks that should have involved due diligence, ethical review, and transparency. The failure was not only individual, it was institutional. Universities, research centers, and academic bodies accepted money from a man who was, at the time of some of these donations, a convicted sex offender, and they did so in ways that ranged from negligent to deliberately concealed. Hawking's attendance at the 2006 conference predates his conviction, but the broader institutional pattern shows a systemic failure that persisted well beyond that point. Calling a lie is part of an honest analysis. We need to address directly the specific false claims that have been most widely circulated about Hawking and Epstein, because a responsible analysis includes correcting misinformation, not just presenting nuanced readings of genuine evidence. The most common false claim is that the Epstein files contain explicit criminal allegations against Hawking, including allegations from victims. This is false. No such allegations exist in the publicly available materials. The documents that have been released through court proceedings and congressional releases do not contain victim testimony accusing Hawking of wrongdoing. Anyone claiming otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately misleading. A second false claim is that Hawking was a regular or frequent visitor to Epstein's island. The documented connection is to a single event, the 2006 conference.
There is no confirmed evidence of multiple visits or an ongoing personal relationship between Hawking and Epstein beyond this specific documented context. A third category of false claim involves the viral photograph, which has been presented in some online contexts with captions implying things that the photograph itself does not show. A photograph is evidence of presence at a location. It is not evidence of the nature of a relationship, of shared knowledge, or of shared conduct. Using a photograph to imply criminal association without additional supporting evidence is a form of visual misinformation. We state all of this clearly not to protect Hawking's reputation artificially, but because accuracy is the foundation of the kind of analysis this channel produces. The genuine story of Hawking and Epstein raises legitimate and important questions. The false version of the story, the one that circulates in viral posts, raises fake questions that distract from the real ones.
Stephen Hawking died on March 14, 2018. He was 76 years old. He had lived for 55 years with a disease that kills most people within 2 to 5 years of diagnosis. He had written books that brought the most complex ideas in modern physics to millions of people. He had given lectures, received honorary degrees from dozens of universities, been named a Fellow of the Royal Society, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was, in the truest sense, a figure of historic significance. How should we think about his posthumous connection to the Epstein files? This is a question worth answering directly. There is a principle that the pursuit of truth does not pause for reputation, including posthumous reputation. If there are legitimate questions about Hawking's presence in Epstein's world, those questions should be asked. Suppressing inconvenient facts because someone is beloved or celebrated is not intellectual honesty. It is a form of hagiography that serves no one's genuine understanding. At the same time, there is a specific ethical obligation that applies when the subject of analysis cannot respond. Hawking cannot explain his reasoning. He cannot correct misrepresentations. He cannot offer the kind of direct testimony that would be most valuable. This asymmetry requires that we be especially precise about what the evidence actually shows, especially transparent about uncertainty, and especially resistant to the slide from documented fact to unsubstantiated implication. The appropriate standard is this: analyze what the evidence confirms, acknowledge what it does not confirm, resist the temptation to fill gaps with inference that goes beyond what the facts support, and maintain the distinction between questions worth asking and conclusions worth drawing. By that standard, Hawking's attendance at the 2006 conference is worth examining and discussing. The false claims that go beyond that documented fact are not. His scientific legacy, the work on Hawking radiation, the contributions to cosmological theory, the decades of engagement with the deepest questions about the nature of space and time, is a separate category from the question of whether he exercised ideal judgment in accepting a conference invitation in 2006. Conflating these categories serves no one's understanding of either.
The story of Stephen Hawking and Jeffrey Epstein is not ultimately a story about whether one specific person made a mistake by attending one specific conference. It is a story about how a system works, how someone like Epstein could construct over years and with extraordinary deliberateness a network of prestigious academic and scientific relationships that served as both a personal identity and a structural shield, and how the institutions and individuals that participated in that network, mostly without awareness of what they were enabling, bear some portion of the responsibility for what Epstein was able to do and how long he was able to do it. The questions this story raises are systemic ones.
What due diligence do universities and research institutions owe when accepting donations from wealthy individuals? What responsibility do scientists have when evaluating invitations from powerful patrons they do not know well? What does it mean that the most prestigious academic institutions in the world accepted money from a man who was, at the time of some of those donations, a convicted sex offender with a known history of predatory conduct? These are not comfortable questions. They implicate institutions that most people regard as among the most trustworthy in the world. Harvard, MIT, Oxford are not names that people associate with enabling criminality. But the Epstein case demonstrates that even these institutions can be instrumentalized when their incentive structures around funding and prestige are not adequately balanced by ethical oversight. For individual scientists like Hawking, the lesson is different but related. Prestige, reputation, and genuine intellectual achievement do not protect against being used as instruments of legitimation by people whose true purposes are concealed. The brightest mind in the world can be present on the darkest island without knowing what the island represents if the information environment makes that knowledge inaccessible. That is not a comfort. It is a warning about how manipulation operates and how difficult it is to defend against when the manipulator is sophisticated, wealthy, and deliberate.
We have now examined every dimension of the Stephen Hawking and Jeffrey Epstein story that the available evidence supports. Let us apply the structured analytical framework that this channel uses for all its assessments, distinguishing clearly between what is confirmed, what is reasonably inferred, and what remains unknown. Level 1. What the documents confirm without reasonable dispute. Stephen Hawking attended a scientific conference organized by Jeffrey Epstein on his private island, Little St. James, in 2006. Epstein was under active criminal investigation by the Palm Beach Police Department at the time, though that investigation had not become a major public news story. No victim in any publicly available document has accused Hawking of wrongdoing. No document in the released files contains a criminal allegation against him. His name appears in the Epstein record in the specific and bounded context of conference attendance. These are the confirmed facts. Level 2. What the pattern of evidence reasonably supports as inference. Epstein deliberately and systematically cultivated relationships with famous scientists to build social legitimacy and provide structural cover for his activities. Hawking's attendance at the conference served this function regardless of his awareness of it. The evidence strongly suggests that Hawking did not have knowledge of the full extent of Epstein's criminal conduct at the time of the 2006 conference, based on the limited public availability of that information to someone in his specific geographic, social, and professional context. His physical situation meant that decisions about travel were made collaboratively with his care team, whose role in evaluating the conference invitation is not part of the public record. These are reasonable inferences, not confirmed facts, but they are grounded in the available evidence. Level 3. What remains unknown and may never become known. Whether Hawking or anyone in his team had any information about Epstein's conduct beyond what was available in public reporting. Whether there were financial connections between Epstein and research programs associated with Hawking that have not been publicly documented. What Hawking's private thoughts were about Epstein, the conference, and the broader world that Epstein represented. Whether he ever learned more about Epstein's crimes before his own death in 2018. What he would have said about all of this had he been alive when the full story became public in 2019. These questions have no available answers. The AI verdict, based strictly on the evidence at all three levels, is this. Stephen Hawking's presence in the Epstein files reflects the success of Epstein's strategy of embedding himself in the world's most prestigious intellectual and scientific networks. It does not reflect criminal conduct, complicity, or knowing participation in wrongdoing on Hawking's part. The evidence that would support such a conclusion does not exist in the public record. At the same time, the story is not nothing.
It is an important and underexamined part of the broader Epstein narrative, the part that explains how a predator operated for decades behind a shield of intellectual respectability. Hawking was one element of that shield, almost certainly without knowing it. The lesson here extends far beyond one scientist and one criminal. It is about how systems of prestige and legitimacy can be exploited by people with the resources and the deliberateness to do so. It is about the responsibility of institutions to ask harder questions about the people whose money they accept. And it is about the limits of individual knowledge and individual agency in environments where information is strategically managed by those who benefit from its suppression. We do not know the whole truth. Some of it may never be known. What we can do is hold the confirmed facts firmly, maintain clear boundaries between fact and inference, resist the sensationalism that distorts this story in both directions, and continue to demand the transparency that cases like this require. Thank you for watching.